In the golden light of ancient Egypt, in the time when the pharaohs ruled with absolute authority, in the shadow of temples and pyramids that reached toward the heavens, there existed a secret so carefully guarded, so deliberately hidden from the official records of history, that it has remained unknown to the world for thousands of years. This is the story of the Eye of Ra, not as a symbol of divine power wielded by the pharaoh, but as a consciousness, a woman of extraordinary spiritual development who understood the true nature of the divine feminine, and who dared to defy the patriarchal authority of the pharaoh himself. This is the story of the hidden daughter of the sun, a woman who was born into the royal family but who chose a different path, who recognized that the power of the pharaoh was based on illusion and control, who worked in secret to preserve the true knowledge of the divine feminine and to guide the evolution of human consciousness. And this is the story of how her legacy has been hidden from history, how her name has been erased, how her teachings have been suppressed, and how her consciousness is awakening once again in the hearts and minds of women across the world who are ready to remember what has been forgotten. The story begins in ancient Egypt, in the time of the New Kingdom, when the pharaohs were at the height of their power, when the temples were filled with priests who served the interests of the state rather than the interests of truth and spiritual awakening. In this time, there was born into the royal family a daughter of the pharaoh, a woman who would come to be known as Sekhmet, though this was not her only name, not her only identity, not her only role in the great work of spiritual transformation that was unfolding. Sekhmet was born with the consciousness of an ancient priestess, a being who had lived through many lifetimes, who carried within her the memory of the true teachings, who understood that the divine feminine was not subordinate to the masculine, but was co-equal with it, and in fact was the primary principle from which all things emerged. From her earliest childhood, Sekhmet understood that something was profoundly wrong with the world as it had been presented to her, that the teachings of the official priesthood were distortions of the truth, that the power of the pharaoh was based on the suppression of the divine feminine and the control of human consciousness. She grew up in the palace of the pharaoh, surrounded by luxury and power, but she felt no attachment to these things. She felt drawn instead to the hidden chambers of the temple, to the secret teachings that were preserved by a small group of priestesses who understood the truth and who were committed to its preservation. She felt drawn to the knowledge of the divine feminine, to the understanding that the Eye of Ra was not a symbol of the pharaoh's power, but was a consciousness, a principle of awareness that could awaken within all beings, particularly within women. As Sekhmet grew older, she began to understand her role. She understood that she had been born into the royal family not to serve the interests of the pharaoh, but to work from within the system to preserve the true teachings, to guide the evolution of consciousness, to ensure that the knowledge of the divine feminine would not be completely lost. She understood that she would have to live a double life, appearing to serve the pharaoh while secretly working to undermine the systems of control that he represented. She began her training in secret, learning from the priestesses who understood the true teachings, learning the practices and disciplines that would activate the Eye of Ra consciousness within her, learning how to perceive dimensions of reality that were invisible to ordinary awareness, learning how to access the infinite wisdom and infinite power that existed within the divine feminine. She learned meditation practices that would expand her consciousness. She learned the sacred geometry that encoded the knowledge of the divine feminine. She learned the symbols that represented the path of awakening. But Sekhmet also understood something that many spiritual seekers failed to understand. She understood that spiritual knowledge alone was not enough. She understood that the true work of transformation required engaging with the systems of power, understanding how they worked, and working to transform them from within. And so she began to work actively to undermine the authority of the pharaoh, to question his teachings, to guide those around her toward the recognition of the divine feminine. She did this carefully, subtly, in ways that would not immediately draw the attention of the authorities. She would speak to the women of the court about their own power, about the divine feminine that existed within them, about the possibility of awakening to their true nature. She would work with the priestesses to preserve and transmit the ancient teachings. She would create art and poetry that encoded the knowledge of the divine feminine in symbols that only those with the wisdom to understand would be able to perceive. But eventually, her work began to be noticed. The Pharaoh's advisors began to suspect that she was spreading teachings that were contrary to the official doctrine. They began to watch her more closely. They began to question her loyalty. And Sekhmet understood that the time had come for her to make a choice. She could continue to live in the palace, to maintain her position of privilege, to work in secret while appearing to serve the Pharaoh, or she could openly defy the Pharaoh, could speak the truth openly, could work openly to awaken consciousness to the knowledge of the divine feminine, knowing that this would result in her exile, her persecution, perhaps even her death. It was during a night of deep meditation in a secret chamber beneath the temple that Sekhmet received a vision that would change everything. In this vision, she found herself in the presence of the ancient priestesses themselves, women of immense wisdom and power who had lived in previous ages, who had worked to preserve the true teachings, who had guided the evolution of consciousness through the ages. And they spoke to her, telling her that the time had come for the truth to be revealed, that she had been prepared for this moment, that her role was to openly defy the Pharaoh and to awaken consciousness to the knowledge of the divine feminine. "You have been called," the priestesses said to her, their voices resonating with the authority of ages. "You have been chosen because you carry within you the consciousness of those who came before you, because you have the capacity to understand what others cannot perceive, because you are willing to pay the price that understanding demands. The time has come for the Eye of Ra to be revealed. The time has come for the world to understand that the divine feminine is not subordinate to the masculine, that the Pharaoh's power is based on illusion and control, that true power comes from the awakening of consciousness within all beings. And you have been prepared your entire life for this moment." Sekhmet emerged from this vision transformed. She understood that she could no longer remain silent, could no longer work in secret. She understood that her role was to openly defy the Pharaoh, to speak the truth, to awaken consciousness to the knowledge of the divine feminine, regardless of the consequences. And so she made her choice. She walked into the throne room of the Pharaoh, and she spoke. She spoke of the true nature of the divine feminine. She spoke of how the Pharaoh's power was based on the suppression of women and the suppression of consciousness. She spoke of how the true teachings had been distorted and hidden. She spoke of how the Eye of Ra was not a symbol of the Pharaoh's power, but was a consciousness that could awaken within all beings. The Pharaoh was enraged. He declared her a heretic, a traitor, a woman who had defied his authority. He ordered her arrest, but Sekhmet did not resist. She allowed herself to be taken, knowing that her work was not about her personal survival, but about the awakening of consciousness, about the preservation of the true teachings, about the transformation of human civilization. She was taken to the desert, exiled from the kingdom, left to die in the wilderness. But Sekhmet did not die. Instead, she went deeper into the desert, to a hidden place where other priestesses had established a sanctuary, a place where the true teachings could be preserved and transmitted. And there, in the silence of the desert, she continued her work. She wrote down the teachings. She trained other priestesses. She created a legacy that would survive the centuries, that would eventually emerge into human consciousness when the time was right. If you want a practical, step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Sekhmet spent years in the desert, working to preserve and transmit the knowledge of the Eye of Ra, the consciousness of the divine feminine that had been suppressed by the Pharaoh and the official priesthood. She created texts that encoded the knowledge in symbols and metaphors. She trained priestesses who would carry the teachings forward. She established networks of initiates who understood the truth and who were committed to its preservation. She understood that her work would not bear fruit in her own lifetime, that the full awakening of consciousness would take centuries, that the knowledge would have to be preserved in hidden forms, waiting for the time when humanity was ready to receive it. But she also understood that her work was essential, that without the preservation of this knowledge, consciousness would remain trapped in the illusions and limitations that the patriarchal systems had created. She worked with the priestesses to create a comprehensive teaching that would help others understand the Eye of Ra, that would guide them toward the recognition of the divine feminine within themselves, that would help them understand that they too could awaken to the consciousness that she had awakened to. She created practices and disciplines that would facilitate this awakening. She created symbols and sacred geometry that would encode the knowledge in forms that would survive the centuries. But Sekhmet also understood something profound about the nature of power and the nature of transformation. She understood that the awakening of consciousness could not be forced or imposed from outside, but had to be awakened from within. She understood that her role was not to create followers or to establish a new religion, but to preserve the knowledge and to create the conditions under which consciousness could awaken to its own nature. She understood that the Pharaoh represented a principle of consciousness that was based on the illusion of separation, on the belief that some beings were superior to others, on the use of power to dominate and control. She understood that this principle would eventually collapse, that consciousness would eventually awaken to its true nature, that the knowledge of the divine feminine would eventually be restored to the center of human awareness. In her final years, Sekhmet worked to synthesize all of the knowledge she had gathered to create a comprehensive teaching that would serve as a guide for the awakening of the Eye of Ra consciousness in human awareness. She wrote a final text that was intended to be her magnum opus, a complete guide to understanding the divine feminine, recognizing the Eye of Ra within oneself, and participating in the great work of transformation that would reshape human consciousness and human civilization. When Sekhmet died, her work lived on. The knowledge she had preserved and transmitted was carried forward by the priestesses who had trained with her, who understood the truth and who were committed to its preservation. The texts she had written were hidden in secret places, waiting for the time when they could be fully revealed. The networks of initiates that she had established continued to work in secret, preserving the knowledge, transmitting it to future generations, ensuring that the truth would not be completely lost. And in our own time, we are witnessing the emergence of the knowledge that Sekhmet preserved in unprecedented ways. We are seeing women rising to claim their power and their voice. We are seeing the recognition of the divine feminine as a primary principle. We are seeing the collapse of institutions that had been built on the suppression of the divine feminine. We are seeing the emergence of new forms of spirituality that honor the sacred feminine as equal to the sacred masculine. The Eye of Ra is no longer hidden. The truth about the hidden daughter of the sun is being revealed. The divine feminine is being recognized as a fundamental principle of consciousness. And those who are ready to receive this knowledge, who are willing to open their hearts and minds to the wisdom that Sekhmet preserved, who are committed to the awakening of the divine feminine within themselves and within all beings, are being called to step forward to recognize their role in the great work of transformation. Sekhmet defied the Pharaoh because she understood that his power was based on illusion and control. She understood that true power came from the awakening of consciousness, from the recognition of the divine feminine, from the alignment of one's awareness with the infinite intelligence that pervaded all existence. She understood that her role was not to gain power for herself, but to awaken consciousness to its own power, to help others recognize the Eye of Ra within themselves. And the question that is being posed to each of us is this: will you recognize the Eye of Ra within yourself? Will you awaken to the divine feminine consciousness that Sekhmet worked to preserve? Will you help to guide others toward the recognition of the divine feminine? Will you participate in the transformation of human consciousness that will honor and celebrate the sacred feminine that Sekhmet died to protect? The Eye of Ra is awakening. The hidden daughter of the sun is being remembered. The divine feminine is rising, and the healing and transformation of all consciousness is beginning. The time of suppression is ending. The time of revelation is beginning. And you are invited to become part of this great awakening, to claim your role in the restoration of the knowledge that Sekhmet preserved, to help guide humanity toward the recognition of the divine feminine that will reshape all creation. And if you liked this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.